All right, folks. Well, let's dive right in. One of my favorite things to do for the first lecture of this class is to talk about a day in your life and the different things that the government and nonprofit organizations have to do with some of the most mundane things that you go through every day. So let's dive right on in. If I can share my screen. So let's talk about, the first thing that you do in the morning. You wake up. Either your alarm clock goes off, or these days it's probably your cell phone, right? It's, gotta get up. So if you are still using one of those old fancy alarm clock things, you'll or any other device, you'll notice on a lot of electrical plugs a little label that says UL. Well, that certification is actually an accreditation by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to make sure that it's not going to burn down your house. Also, if you're using your phone, then the radio in it, what connects to cell towers and all that, it's regulated by the FCC, and so are the various carriers. So whether you're on Verizon or T-Mobile or Sprint or AT&T, all of that, all of that's been regulated. So here, first thing in the morning, you've already had some sort of effect from the government, whether or not you've even thought about it. So you roll out of bed, and if you're like me, you're pretty groggy and you got to go crawl into the shower. Um, so you jump in the shower. Your shampoos, your deodorant, you're brushing your teeth, your toothpaste. All of these are products that are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, both to make sure that they're unadulterated and to ensure that they're safe for people to use. That hair dryer you might pull out, you're definitely going to notice a UL label on the end of that. The standards behind all of your plumbing and wiring are regulated and dictated by the state building codes. And, it's also subject to housing and urban development or FHA or VA rules if you're trying to purchase a house with certain of their financing programs. There are basic standards of habitability that are out there. The electricity and the water that you use are charged at rates that are set and approved by the Michigan Public Service Commission. And these are generated in facilities that are subject to state and federal inspections for safety and environmental responsibility. Okay, so we've gotten a shower. That's a lot of government already. Let's get dressed. Well, federal labeling requirements on your clothes mean that you're not going to be wearing textiles that you might have allergies to. So if you're like my sister and you get contact dermatitis problems from shoes that have rubber in their soles, you can avoid that. And, because there's going to be labeling that says this is 100% leather. It's possible that, if you're wearing pajama bottoms or something, that it might have been treated with a flame retardant because that is a huge safety concern. All right, so we're dressed. We know what we're wearing. Looking good. Kind of ready to tackle the day. Probably not if you're like me, not a morning person. So let's get in the car, gonna head off to work, head off to school, head off where we're going. Well, the road that you're driving on is built and maintained by state or local government agencies. The standards for the roads are set by the federal and state departments of transportation. And that also determines things like what mix of asphalt you're going to use, whether you should use asphalt or concrete. How long should the traffic light last? I mean, I'm looking at you, Stadium and Drake, and again, Westman and Drake. Um, what the speed limit should be. The car itself has been tested and certified under standards issued by the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. If you're listening to the radio in the car, that's about the only time I listen to the radio anymore. That the radio stations themselves are governed by FCC guidelines, and they have to limit their broadcasting to certain spectrums. Okay, well, my low fuel light's on. Better stop to get gas. Well, the Bureau of Land Management oversees the drilling operation that generates the oil that eventually turns into gasoline. Um, and the EPA has a lot of different regulations that govern fuel additives. I'm recording this in May. So right now we're switching over to the summer blends. In the winter, after Labor Day or so, we get a winter blend because at different outdoor temperatures, there are just better blends that reduce emissions and pollutants for the environment. Um, and then you've also got the State Department of Weights and Measures that is certifying those gas pumps to make sure that you're not getting ripped off, to make sure that the pump starts at zero. And that is, if it says that you're getting a gallon of gas, you're actually getting a gallon and not, let's say, 90% of a gallon. All right. All right. We got gas in the car. Got a little extra time. Let's stop for breakfast. I'm hungry, right? I could use a chicken biscuit. Well, the let's say, even if you're just pulling through a drive-through, or maybe you're gonna, take a little extra time, go stop at Blue Dolphin or something like that. Well, the restaurant is subject to commercial building codes for safety of the workers and its patrons. Routine health inspections to make sure that, first of all, that the kitchen is being maintained safely and it's clean. Things like having air gaps in the sink so that water doesn't backflow up. You don't want to know. Um, making sure that the kitchen is free of pests. You really don't want to be eating at a restaurant that is full of roaches or rodents or anything really disgusting. And so the health department makes sure that all the standards are being met. That's local government right there, but also some state regulations. All right, breakfast is over. We are finally going to go head to campus, get into school. Well, the university itself is a state agency. It is funded by the state and federal governments as well as your tuition money. Your student loans are subsidized by the federal government. Um, and the parking you get, if we know parking is expensive and hard to come by. But where you get to park is determined by some state employee at the university. The core curriculum that you're taking, these essential studies classes, um, is determined at, there are base standards that are determined at the state level and different uh, agreements between different state universities to ensure transfer equivalency. All right, well, yeah, sure. We're in a government building. Fine. So let's go upstairs to the classroom. Well, there are railings and ramps and elevators and things that are in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, by the way, wasn't even a thing until 1990. Um, so, the elevator, let's say you're riding up to the fourth floor in Sangren, it gets inspected routinely by, by someone at the state to make sure that you're not riding in a death trap. And if you've been in Sangren and you know exactly how often those uh, elevators seem to be malfunctioning, you should be extra grateful for the people who come and inspect them for safety. So maybe we've made it to 10 o'clock in the morning at this point. And obviously, you've already had some pretty significant things in your life that are influenced, at least by government or nonprofit organizations, and you don't even really realize it. So that leads us to think, God, government's got to be huge, massive, sprawling, right? Well, in actuality, the size of the government as a proportion of our population hasn't really grown or shrank all that much. I mean, it ebbs and flows over the years, but it really hasn't changed much since before the Great Depression. So for over 100 years, we've had relatively stable size of government as a proportion of our population. At the federal level, there are about 2 million employees, not including about 600,000 people who work for the post office. The post office, by the way, is not a government agency. It's a government-owned enterprise. It's slightly different. Um, so we tend to keep the postal employees separate from the folks that we talk about as being federal government employees. But most of the government stuff happens at the state and the local level. Um, and if you include teachers, police, fire, stuff like that, you're looking at about 20 million people total out of a population of about 350 million or so in the US. Um, in Michigan, we have about 182,000 people who work for various state departments, whether that's in budget and finance, or the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, the Attorney General's office, the Secretary of State's office. Those are people who handle a lot of different stuff, and government kind of touches everything. Into the city of Detroit, for example, has 9,000 employees. They do all the local stuff. Think about your parks. Let's see, there's parks and recreation, local road maintenance, you know the folks who occasionally fill in potholes and things like that, like we love to complain about. Those are local employees, and that local employees are where a lot of the work really does happen. There's an old saying that all politics are local, and that's because most of the things that affect us in our day-to-day lives that we might have complaints about or have opinions about are going to be happening at the local level. And it's the local level that usually responds to these problems. But there are a lot of things that, um, when we talk about the local level, it's not just going to be in your city. There are a lot of overlaps there. You've got county governments, you've got, your municipal or your city government. And then there are townships or towns that are slightly different in terms of their authorities and districts. So, here in Kalamazoo, you're going to be under the Kalamazoo County commissioners in the county government. You're also going to have either the city of Kalamazoo or the Kalamazoo Charter Township local governments that that are responsive to you, depending on where exactly in Kalamazoo you live. Actually, just right off campus is the line between the city and the county. So you can walk half a block, or let's say 2 blocks away, coming from the Valley dorms. You go through that gate, you hang a left up onto Dartmouth Street. You'll notice where the sidewalks start and the curbs end. Well, the sidewalk side is where the township is, and the curbs are where the city of Kalamazoo is. There are also sometimes special districts that manage things like transportation or water and sewer districts, especially for larger areas where you've got multiple different municipalities. So, for example, the Kalamazoo, the bus system here is both city, county, city of Kalamazoo, the county, the township, and the city of Portage. There's a great link to a John Oliver segment from last week tonight about special districts. Really, really encourage you to watch that, because it's going to be very eye-opening about some of the power that some of these special districts can have over your life. So you would think that with all of that, God, we've got all these people, government does all this stuff. All of our problems in society should be handled. Well, not really. So we have nonprofit organizations that help to fill in the gaps. And, the nonprofit sector in itself, or as we sometimes call it, the third sector, that's a force of nature on its own. It's almost as large as the federal government. Look at that, 12.3 million employees nationwide in the nonprofit sector versus about 20 or 20 in state and local employees. God, that's a lot. It's a lot of people. And almost 500,000 in Michigan alone. And nonprofits touch everything. Any sort of different cogent field, anything from, animals and the environment to education, to health, to arts and leisure. So the government and nonprofit organizations really can touch any aspect of life. So that leads me to, how does the government actually do what it does? How do they, sometimes it's direct service provision. That's not really that common, but you do see it in things like police and fire departments. You do also sometimes see this in programs that provide income supports or other transfer programs. So things like Social Security and disability insurance, SNAP, your supplemental nutrition program, Also, we call that food stamps. Libraries often, sometimes they're run by the government, sometimes they're nonprofit organizations, but that's direct service provision. Contracting out is also very popular. And this is where you've got a written agreement with with some sort of agency, whether it's a for-profit company or a nonprofit organization, to deliver goods or services. This goes all the way back to World War II when private companies started developing and building warplanes for the war effort. Private security companies provide mercenaries in certain war zones. So we've heard a lot of that over the last 20 years. They also work in kidnapping and recovery in places where the United States says, well, we don't negotiate with terrorists. So there are, sometimes quietly things done behind the scenes. And that happens. This is sometimes referred to as government by proxy because it's still doing the work that the government wants done. It's just having someone else do the actual work. Generally, this is thought of as, to be a way for um, services to be provided effectively, but at a lower price. In reality, it's not always, more effective or, better service or more cost efficient. There's a lot of specificity that's required in drawing up these contracts. And there's a lot of oversight that's required to make sure that the contracts are being followed. So a lot of the times the cost that is required to oversee these contracts can end up offsetting any savings that you might have seen. It's also kind of popular because it permits more flexibility in hiring and firing. Because the HR compliance burden is shifted to the contractor. And as we'll talk about later in the semester, it can actually be a very lengthy process to hire someone in the government setting, and even more lengthy process to fire someone. So there is an advantage there in terms of flexibility. And it's also, seen to be is a great way to build new programs or expand existing ones without being under the scrutiny of, oh, you're just making government bigger. It's never unpopular to bash bureaucrats. So, it's really easy to say, we don't need a new government program. We don't need more people working in the government, all of that sort of stuff. Well, if the government does it through contractors, then that becomes more, somehow more palatable. And contracting back in has sort of become a thing in recent years, especially after we've seen that with the extra, compliance costs and what have you, the need to oversee and monitor contracts. We've seen it shift to contracting back in, where some governments are starting to shift back to direct service provision. And then we've got grants. This is where the government gives you money to do stuff. And, so sometimes that goes to lower level governments like state and local agencies. Sometimes it goes to nonprofit organizations. Sometimes grants go to for-profit companies who want to build out infrastructure or something like that. So here are some examples. The 21st Century Community Learning Centers program. If you guys went to an after-school program at a public school, you might have gone to one of these 21st century programs. All grants come with certain strings attached and regulations or standards that you have to meet. So in the 21st century programs, that's, having an educational component, some sort of recreational component, and a nutritional component that includes an enriched wheat product. So I actually worked as an evaluator for about 25 or so of these programs years ago. Their components included homework help and tutoring. The recreational components were all over the place. Some schools had tennis lessons. Some schools had etiquette classes. Some schools did volleyball. Some schools also, focused more on the educational stuff and would have the mobile petting zoos and, science teachers come in doing the fun experiments and stuff. That's all grant funded, and it's funded down to the states. And then the states also set their own requirements and give, and then funnel that money out to the school districts. Transportation grants. Typically, there are block grants that the federal government gives to the states. It's just a big chunk of money, and it's to be used for transportation, for road building, stuff like that. Um, yeah. And then, I mentioned private companies. Back in 2009, there was a big stimulus package after what we called the Great Recession. And I worked as a grant writer actually for the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program that was run by the Department of Commerce, so BTOP. And the BTOP grants would fund out 80% of the cost for private companies to build out broadband infrastructure, especially in underserved or unserved areas, as determined by the rules set out by the Department of Commerce. And so we ended up getting about $40 million in funding to build fiber optic networks that would serve, wireless internet service to schools and homes throughout rural Mississippi. And we had to skip certain areas because they were not considered unserved or underserved. There are strings attached, but yes, a private company can get government money in some cases. Regulations. Regulations are often referred to as red tape, but that's not what red tape is. And because one of my favorite professors in grad school actually wrote the book on red tape, I will tell you the definition of what red tape actually is. Red tape is a rule or procedure that entails some sort of compliance burden, but it doesn't serve its functional object any longer. So maybe you filled out a form that was really important for record keeping in compliance with, some grant funding that you were getting, but you're not getting the grant funding anymore and you're still filling out the form. That would qualify as red tape. Just because something is annoying or burdensome doesn't automatically make it red tape. And in fact, there's sometimes that we refer to green tape in terms of rules that have a compliance burden but actually provides benefit. In the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR, is huge for a reason. Most regulations, in some way or another, are written in blood. The government very rarely looks to proactively create regulations around something. It's almost entirely reactive. So, and a different favorite professor of mine loved to use this as an example of why rulemaking is important, and also just to kind of freak you out a little bit. You don't really think about, when you go buy spices at the grocery store, let's say, your paprika. Paprika's nice for certain things. I like to use it in rub for my barbecue. I don't like to think about how many rodent hairs are going to be present in my bottle of paprika. I don't want to have to think about that. I don't want to have to think about the fact that it's possible that there are rodent hairs in my bottle of paprika. But in fact, there is a federal rule about the maximum number per gram or something like that of rodent hairs that are permissible in your spices, including paprika. These are standards that are followed to ensure that you have a safe food supply. So think about like breakfast cereal or something. Here's another gross out moment. There are regulations that limit the number of insect parts that can be found. But when you think about it, we grow corn, we grow wheat, we grow grain outside. That is where the bugs live. They're going to be getting into silos and stuff like that. Not everything is going to be caught. And yeah, so sometimes you are going to have little bitty bits of bugs in your cereal, but it's okay because the federal government makes sure that it's not too much. It's just the right amount of protein. At any rate, regulations are important. And whether you're talking about environmental regulation or, regulations about road safety standards and, having to have airbags in your car, things like that, they're all written for a reason. We also have tax expenditures is a way for government to do what it does. And in that, tax expenditures are kind of weird because what's happening is the federal government is giving up tax money that it otherwise could have collected to encourage some sort of behavior. So, for example, it promotes certain behaviors, it discourages others. So your homeownership tax credit, your mortgage tax credit, that's considered to be a tax expenditure because the government is foregoing some revenue that it might get in order to promote and encourage people to buy homes. So, if your parents own their home, or if you are a student who is fortunate enough to be, to own your own home at this point in your life, when you file your taxes every year, that is a tax expenditure that you are likely taking advantage of. Another one that's probably more fitting for younger college folks is the earned income tax credit. And it is a tax expenditure that is designed to make a slight abatement to poverty. So people who earn income on W-2, who have earned income, get a refundable tax credit. That means that even if you didn't pay that much money in, you'll still get that much back. Um, you know, it, if you earn money and it's not a whole lot of money, the government's going to give you a little bit of extra money just because, first of all, you're going to spend it and it's going to stimulate the economy, but also because there's, considered to be, a moral obligation to have some sort of abatement for people who are of the lowest incomes. And then there's loan programs. So, student loans are our favorite. We all love to hate our student loans, don't we? But there are also things like lending to farmers. Um, Often farmers borrow at the beginning of the year, and then they borrow based off of anticipated crop revenues. Lending to banks. You've probably heard, especially in the last couple of years, about all these federal interest rate hikes. Well, what's that about? Well, um, banks have to keep a certain amount of cash on hand. And at the end of every business day, if they don't have that much money, they have to borrow it from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve's key interest rate is how much it costs banks to borrow from the Fed. And because this rate varies, to tighten up or loosen up the control of money, and how it flows, that it's sort of a different lever that we push to try and influence the way the economy is growing or not growing. So as I'm recording this, we've just had another 0.25% rate hike, and we hopefully out of them. But because it's costing the banks to get more to get money, it costs you more to use your credit cards, to carry a balance on those credit cards. It's going to cost you more if you want to buy a house or want to buy a car or anything that you might need to finance. And so that's something that people pay attention to. So yeah, there are a lot of loan programs, including small business loans. And during the pandemic, the PPP loans that were used to bail out small businesses. Those are all different examples of loan programs that the federal government offers. And then state and local governments can offer similar programs as well. Oh, so that's the government. Let's talk about the nonprofits. Um, we often call the nonprofit sector the third sector, and there's some, sometimes a blend of, we also talk about it as part of civil society. Um, all these concepts kind of roll in together. Civil society is the idea that, we're engaged in our community and public decision making, and that, we help one another, we build social capital, we care about our own community. One thing I do want to notice is that the nonprofit sector is often tagged as having some sort of liberal bias. And yeah, individuals with a lot of strong social or altruistic values do tend to be more likely to go into the third sector because they see those values as aligning with their own. And some do tend to be more left wing. But generally, we look at the nonprofit sector as neutral because it's separated from that top-down bureaucratic approach to those great society programs we see, like Medicare, Medicaid, um, and there's also a liberal, a thought that nonprofits are a little more liberal because they are so able to mobilize at the grassroots level. But the thing is, conservatives like it too. It gives opportunities for services to be provided in society without risking government becoming too big. The faith-based component to nonprofit organization is tremendous. Um, you know, in the early 2000s, in the George W. Bush administration, there was a big conservative push to allow for inducements for basically federal funding to be given to faith-based initiatives, including those that might have inducements to get people to participate in religious programming. So in other words, let's say if you go to to a food pantry and they can require you to participate in some prayer service or something before they give you food. It, that's completely conservative, and especially in the faith-based community. Obviously, there are plenty of liberal groups in the faith-based community as well, but we tend to see them most prominently from the conservative side of things. There's also conservatives love the nonprofit sector because it can be an innovation sandbox. You can try out potential solutions to national problems at the small scale and see if it scales up, see if it's something that you can replicate. And you can do it outside of the government, which is always something that conservatives like to see. But there are some key features, and there are three really core features to nonprofit organizations. The first is that there is no coercion. You cannot be required to participate in a nonprofit or to become a member of a nonprofit. So it's more private than the government sector is in that case. Because obviously you can't, apart from people who like to declare themselves sovereign citizens, which is not a thing, you really can't opt out of being subject to government. You can opt out of a nonprofit. They also don't distribute profits. One of the biggest misconceptions about nonprofit organizations is that they have no money and they spend everything they bring in. It's actually a good thing for nonprofits to have a little left over at the end of the year, to build up reserves and to have, a rainy day or emergency fund. The thing is with nonprofits is that you don't have shareholders. So if there is money left over at the end of the year, it stays with the organization. It goes back to those, to the purposes of the organizations. And then there aren't really clear lines of accountability and ownership. And this is something that's unique to the nonprofit sector because we talk a lot about governance in the nonprofit sector. Who's in charge and who are we accountable to? Are you accountable to the board of directors that runs your organization? Or are you accountable to the people you serve? Well, in the nonprofit sector, it's both. And that can cause some conflicts and some ethical dilemmas at times. Now, one other important thing to note here, not every nonprofit is tax exempt. You can organize on a not-for-profit basis, exist in the state of Michigan or any other state, and never go bother filing for recognition as a nonprofit organization through the IRS. Nonprofit, IRS tax exemption means that you don't have to pay any taxes on your revenues and incomes, sure. But in some cases, if you're a 501c3, and I'll get to that in a minute, then donations are tax deductible. That's not true for every type of nonprofit either. So that's why you want to make sure that you're speaking clearly when you say, yes, this is tax deductible, or no, it's not, because it's that it does depend. So how does the IRS determine if you're eligible? Well, first of all, what's the primary purpose of your organization? What's in your articles of incorporation? What's your mission statement say? And then they won't look at your organizational documents. So that is your articles of incorporations, bylaws that govern how the organization is run. Whether or not you've got, conflict of interest policies and whistleblower policies are questions that they ask when you apply for nonprofit status. Um, and then the operational test of what does the organization actually do? Are you doing things that we consider to be tax exempt, not for profit stuff? Or are you doing something that you're calling a nonprofit but isn't really? Um, so they'll also look at a couple other things. First, to make sure that there's no private inurement. And what this means is that none of the net earnings are going to unduly benefit someone who's in the organization. So excessive salaries or improper deductions or something like that. And that includes awarding contracts or something that unfairly favor a board member, executive, or someone else with close ties. So, giving sweetheart deals to people who, maybe are buddy with someone working in a nonprofit, and you're going to give them that nice printing contract, even though they're not the cheapest or the best or the lowest bid. And then also they've got to have some public benefit. They have to have some sort of benefit to the public at large. So when you think about the American Medical Association, it's a it's a professional organization that's primarily for the benefit of its members, but it does, through educational activities and what have you, it does have some benefit to the public as well. So, as I said, there are a lot of different types of nonprofits. So here they are. 501c3s are the most common. These are charitable, religious, educational, or scientific organizations. If you're incorporated for one of those purposes, then you generally, as long as you follow all the other requirements, you generally can become a nonprofit organization, and donations would then be tax exempt. There's also 501c4s, and they're very common. They're what we call social welfare organizations. Sometimes you'll see organizations that have both a 501c3 and a 501c4, and that operate separately. The reason that they do this is because there are very different restrictions on what 501c4s can do in terms of advocacy and lobbying to the federal state governments for, legislative purposes, whereas 501c3s can only do some advocacy type activities. But then there are other tax exempt organizations that do exist under other sections of the IRS's code. So Section 501c5 covers labor unions, agricultural, horticultural organizations, business leagues. So your chambers of commerce, that's 501c6. Social clubs are a C7. And then fraternal societies. And this goes both for, fraternities and sororities, as well as things like, your Elks, your Eagles, your Moose lodges, the Masonic lodges and such. Those have their own sections of the IRS code. Veterans organizations have their own sections. And then there are separate political organizations. There's a separate section for some types of political organizations and, PACs and what have you, as well as some classifications that exist for credit unions, homeowners associations, HMOs, hospitals, and universities have their own sections. So there's lots of different things that can be nonprofit, but not necessarily tax exempt. So, all right. That's it for this lecture. Next time, we'll talk about the different theories about why the government and nonprofit sectors exist.